I don't know what a best director is, except that someone that stands in the same space with the best actors. I feel that they do the work and I get to watch. And nothing's better than that.
Hello everyone and welcome back to Let's Take 5, the podcast where we take a cinema legend, then take 5 of their films to analyze their excellence and range. My name is Austin Lugar.
My name's Eric Martindale.
And this is the first episode where we are not in the same room, actually.
Eric is not in the same room. Eric is going on 2 hours of sleep.
That's what happens.
Eric is very sad. He's very sad.
Sad Eric.
That's right.
I know that you're not like, you don't have a cold or anything, but I am imagining you in McCabe's jacket right now.
I would love to be in McCabe's jacket right now.
You're just huddled in your apartment like that.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's like the greatest thing of all time. I was going to say the greatest jacket, but it's better than that. It's the greatest thing ever.
Well, as we're alluding to, we are going to be covering McCabe and Mrs. Miller today. This is the second film of our Robert Altman 5. Last week you joined us on our discussion of the film MASH. Next week we're going to be covering Nashville, and after that it'll be Shortcuts and A Prairie Home Companion. But this one is a film that came just a year after MASH. It is also based off a novel, this one called McCabe. It is the story of a man named John McCabe, played by Warren Beatty, who arrives in this small town, and he decides that he is going to start a brothel. This is a Western, I believe it takes place in 1902, and he isn't the most successful until he teams up with the Mrs. Miller of the title, played by Julie Christie.
Played brilliantly.
Brilliantly by Julie Christie. Mm-hmm. And this film, I mean, it's such an obvious statement, but it really is the Western version of MASH's to war films, right? I mean, it's... At that time's an example of the genre and a complete takedown of it. And it is filmed in a way where it is and isn't at the same time. Because something I loved about MASH was, I commented on the episode, that it doesn't feel like a set. It just kind of feels like they're in this kind of wasteland with some tents on it. And this doesn't feel like a Western set in a John Wayne sense. It is snow everywhere, and a couple of buildings have been erected in this small area.
Well, you touched on two things that I think are really interesting, just as fun facts about the film. Number one, Warren Beatty once said, I'm afraid that during one of the scenes here, I believe it was Warren Beatty, it was one of the actors who was commenting on one of the tavern scenes, and he said, I don't think you're going to be able to hear what I'm saying. Or Robert Altman told him, well, do you hear everything that's said in a tavern? And then the other thing being that this film was essentially reshot because a part of the film had been shot, and I think a large portion of the film had been shot, and there was no snow on the ground. And then it snowed. So then they had to reshoot a lot of it. So I thought that was pretty interesting as well. I mean, there were some worries about, continuity errors that the snow creates. So yeah, they ended up going about it. This film was shot in Vancouver, actually, and you can kind of tell when you look at it. But notably, something that you said there from the very beginning is that MASH, when you're in the hospital in MASH, it works very much like a military hospital, or what you'd imagine one being like. It's chaos. People are just talking. It's not one thing is in focus, not one, or at the very least, not one thing seems more important than anything else. And that's very much how this town works as well. The town's called Presbyterian Church. It's about putting a brothel in there, so there's your irony. And yeah, the tavern scenes, the scenes outdoors, it's just everywhere. And I think that type of stuff, the type of nuance that adds creates a feeling of, verisimilitude that sort of resonates to the entire picture and, through MASH, and I think even more so here.
Well, and it's such a strangeness, because in so many Westerns, when you have the going west mentality, it always feels like fresh, fertile ground, just ready to start your riches, to start the civilization. This always feels like a struggle. Like, to me, just like my go-to image of this movie is just McCabe struggling through the snow to walk because there's just so much snow. It's not obvious right away, and you can even see that within the plot because there is just an assumption of success where, you know, McCabe says, if I make a brothel, I'll be rich. And it's Mrs. Miller who goes, no, it needs to be good.
Yeah, it needs to be good.
And her monologue about what it takes to make a great brothel is just outstanding because McCabe is thrown for a loop. He has nothing else to say.
I think he just laughs.
Yeah.
Yeah, cracks his egg and takes his double whiskey with his egg. You know, that's, I think, you know, you talk about the struggle. I think that's an important piece to this picture as a whole. I think this film is meant to represent a way of life, so even so much as it's supposed to represent, you know, the actual through line, because that's important to Altman. It was important to him in MASH. It's important to him here. The way of life in the military, the way of life in the Old West, and nothing is going to be easy. Even walking around is going to be more difficult than it is now. There are no paved roads. There are no sidewalks, so you'll be trudging around. There's no snowplow. It's a hard way of living, and I really can't touch on that enough because that's really at the essence and the core of what makes this movie such a great achievement. Like MASH had this too, don't get me wrong, but I think McCabe and Miller is more of the same and more dots connected, more perfection, if you will. You know, and it's not glamorous. It's really dirty and ugly. This film looks like shit.
It does, and that's almost a sign of the great anti-Western is actually depicting it as gross.
Mm-hmm.
And it's interesting comparing the two of MASH and McCabe because MASH is a film that is ready to completely satirize and mock the use of bureaucracy and government and army bureaucracy. This, I mean, one of the tenets of a Western is starting anew. And it's almost too freeing in a way. I mean, it's McCabe's, you know, the threats in his life are those, you know, outsiders who kind of come in. They're people who are brought in to change the status quo because there is no status quo, and anything can happen like that. That couldn't really happen in MASH. You can't have bounty hunters kind of come in and mess with the troops or the equivalent. And McCabe fails almost with that much freedom. I think McCabe would do better in a MASH-like environment.
Well, yeah, I mean, probably. I mean, he comes in, he rolls into town, you get this beautiful Leonard Cohen sort of overture, and he rolls into town. He's got more money, or at the very least, he presents himself with having more money than anyone else. He's buying rounds for everybody, and immediately people are drawn to him, and you're drawn to his personality and who he is. His idea for enterprise and building up and changing the town. So he kind of comes in from the outside in the same way Mrs. Miller kind of comes in from the outside and the way the bounty hunters do. All these forces come into the town of Presbyterian Church that would have been a wholly different place had this never happened. And you kind of see how they sort of affect that through the film. And to me, a large part of that is simply like, you know, it's an old Western type of thing. It's about frontiering and then getting somewhere and being enterprising and building somewhere up. And that's kind of what happens here. You know, you mentioned bounty hunters in the film. That's the only point, in fact, of this movie where you start to it actually starts to feel a little more like a Western. And you said anti-Western, and that is the case. This film, it's one of my favorite Westerns. It's probably my top 2 or 3, but it is an anti-Western. It sort of goes against Western tropes. The hero of this film is not a badass. In fact, he is a poser. He is posturing to pretend that he is a badass, but he is not. The thing he's most famous for at the beginning of the film is killing this man called Bill Roundtree, who we'd never met and we never will meet. this didn't happen. This is a fake story. This isn't true, but it gives him clout, and that's kind of what he's all about. Yeah.
It's always so interesting because on the other podcast, the Immortals, we discussed the film Unforgiven recently, and that definitely falls into a critique of Westerns, maybe a full-on anti-Western as well, but that is still Clint Eastwood. He is a broken, not as heroic character as he usually plays, but he is still a badass. The only other Western I can think of to have this kind of pathetic beta male character we've also covered on this podcast, which is Maverick. Because he is a self-described coward who often lies about his backstory. Whereas that is done for slapstick comedy, this is such a wonderful takedown of masculinity in many ways. And
for sure.
That's something that you don't often see, especially with Warren Beatty.
Well, in a genre that is dominated by male archetypes.
Yes. I mean, like, he's just bad at this. And he's bad at this in a way that the film displays but doesn't preach. Like, it just lets you recognize how bad he is at being alive at this time period.
Right, he's a man from a different time. He's not a man in this time. It's clear, and this is a spoilers podcast, but this guy is not long for this world because he's too stupid to live in it. Like he has some eye for business. He's not totally unclever, but he's way too arrogant, and he postures way too much. The brains of the operation is Mrs. Miller, which you, at the very beginning, when you first meet, it's Julie Christie and Warren Beatty, who were dating in real life whenever this movie was made. But you assume that some sort of, like in a Western would be, that some sort of love or romance will develop between these two characters. But the title is McCabe and Mrs. Miller, and the point that's often noted is that the "and" is not an "and." It's an "and" like, the character.
Ampersand, yeah.
Right, to represent the fact that this is a business partnership. These two people will not have a relationship together. This is not that type of a movie. And in this, and through other things too, I think, first of all, without mentioning, this movie is very, very funny. Yes. But it's literally like if Wes Anderson directed a Western, but also it's funny and heartbreaking the same way as a Wes Anderson film. This is also one of the saddest movies. One of the saddest Westerns I've ever seen. There are shots in this movie that are absolutely heartbreaking. There's events that happen in this that are just terrifyingly sad.
Well, I think that leads into one of the things that we have to bring up, which is the music of this film.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, there's an incredibly anachronistic element to it, which is that Leonard Cohen is all over this film. Mm-hmm. And Leonard Cohen is, to me, a genius but he writes these songs that are...
Well, he wrote them.
Yeah, well, he wrote them. But they're just filled with melancholy, and it's thoughtful melancholy. And even when McCabe doesn't realize how shitty his life is at the moment, when you throw on a Leonard Cohen song over a wide shot, you just kind of go, oh, yeah, this is awful for you. This is not going well.
And sometimes it actually uses it to comedic effect. I think when one of the hookers that he's bringing to the town says she has to go to the bathroom, there's this really interesting full-on zoom into McCabe's face as he just stares at her as a Leonard Cohen song plays. So, like, it's used ironically at some points too. When I was talking about sadness, and I think one of the sadder characters in Western history is the young kid who rolls into town that sleeps with all the hookers is killed by the bounty hunters that are there to kill McCabe, and he's just target practice. And essentially from there, because you have like a general vibe of You never really get a sense of true danger in the film, other than it's just, it's wilderness. But that's the point where you realize, life is really, really cheap here. Really cheap. And outside from just the whores in general, like where they're literally getting their whores or, selling their bodies for a dollar. But the life is just really cheap here. And McCabe isn't special. And the movie makes a point of really putting that nail on the head. Hitting that nail on the head, rather.
Mm-hmm. And it's so interesting because, you mentioned at the very beginning of the podcast how great Julie Christie is as Mrs. Miller. Mm-hmm. And you would think by the title that they would, share screen time, equal amount. And that's not true. Warren Beatty and McCabe's plot lines are in the film, I think, a lot more.
Yeah.
But that is almost by the intent of Mrs. Miller, because she sees him, she kind of understands him immediately, and knows how to benefit off him. So, when he dies at the end, I'm not sure she's going to mourn him at all, because he was the exact jumping off point she needed to have success, because even in a land full of kind of new society forming, there are still societal norms that prohibit her from just immediate success.
Well, she's not going to have success anyway because she's an opium addict.
That too.
And I think that's the what sort of ties how sad the movie is in general, is that you have McCabe, who in this gunfight outguns these bounty hunters, which is just incredible. But it's all done really clumsily. There's nothing special or stylized about it. It almost feels like he's literally accidentally knocking out Mike Tyson. And it does it, it does it in this really, really neat way. And he doesn't look cool while he's doing it. It looks more like, oh my God, I can't believe he keeps surviving. Again, part of the anti-Western. And then his body sits there in the snow as the snow falls. No one knows he's there. No one knows this is going on. Everyone's focused on the church that's burning in the distance, which there's some commentary there. Considering all the people who went to the church stopped going to the church when he brought all the whores to the town. But so the church is burning. Everyone's doing that. Everyone's ignoring McCabe, who's just slowly drifting away, passing away in the snow. And then it cuts to who you see Julie Christie, who's getting high in the Chinatown section of the village off opium. And she's not mourning his death. There's no one to mourn McCabe's death. McCabe didn't have friends. He had business partners. And she is also, she's not going to go any further either, because she has serious demons of her own. The story ends here, definitively to me. And it ends in a very sad way. The bounty hunters are dead. The church is burned down. This town's called Presbyterian Church. McCabe's dead. No one cares. And the person that you would think would care the most, who shares the title with him, McCabe and Mrs. Miller, she's getting high off opium. She's not thinking about him at all. And the Leonard Cohen music plays.
Well, there's an interesting amount of, I think, cynicism as well as sadness in all of this, because, we're having these characters create a brothel. Mm-hmm. And there's not really a judgment on the film about prostitution.
It's the Wild West. I don't think anyone cares.
No, but the film isn't preaching against it or anything like that.
Sure.
But there is something that I think the film is looking upon. I haven't thought this out clearly, so I'm going to make it as I go along.
That's all I do, Austin.
Oh, good. I'm glad
that's all I do on this podcast.
But there's something.
I didn't even see this movie.
Oh, God.
I'm reading the Wikipedia page
for the first time. But there's something about how it's not wrong, to offer people these choices. But this film seems to imply that, if you present a vice, it will be used. There was never any doubt whether a brothel would be successful, even in a town called Presbyterian Church. But if someone's offering opium or if someone's offering prostitution, it will always be taken. And I think that there's something about that. And I'm not comparing necessarily the the act of prostitution to the act of opium. Like there is something about how we have these compulsions. Do you get what I'm saying? Am I getting?
Well,
it? Yeah.
I mean, in a way, I think the opium's a little different though, just because the only person that we don't see, other than the Asian people in the movie, who are they're Chinese people, they're the people that brought the opium. No one else uses opium but her,
Mm-hmm.
and everyone takes part in the boozing and the whoring. So, I mean, Mrs. McCabe's for sale too. Yeah. So like the opium to me is a little different. That seems like her own vice, if that makes sense. But not to say that necessarily that means your point, because I don't think that invalidates your point. It just means that in this specific case, if everyone was using opium, I'm not sure the ending would be as poignant.
No, it's true. I just kind of almost imagined a parallel film where someone opens an opium shop.
Yeah.
Like you have these things that like we're looking for a new start, and you have people who are walking into unmarked territory and saying this should be a church town. You have people also walking in and saying this should be a brothel town, and everyone's just kind of presenting the world they want, and there will always be people who will want them, but maybe not always satisfied by them. Again, I'm building this piece as I speak.
No, I kind of hear what you're saying. It's just that I'm hung up on opium, and the reason why is because there was a cultural significance that we're not grasping here. Opium by the white people in the town was considered dirty because the Chinese were using it. So she would have used opium in secret, which she does throughout the film. And then in the end, when we see her using opium, she is around other people, but she's in the portion of the town populated by the Chinese. So that just, I know I'm getting really hung up on this.
No, but it's making sense. And again, I'm just thinking this out as I speak. It's just really interesting.
It's not that they wouldn't necessarily want to use the vice, but they wouldn't want to use something that someone they consider was a lesser race or a lesser people is using. That would be dirty. And I think actually the bartender, the original proprietor of the bar in town there says something like he doesn't let opium heads in his establishment or something like that.
It's such an interesting look at like the professionalism of vices, because I'm now thinking back about the wonderful Mrs. Miller monologue about the way to best run a brothel, and a lot of that way of best run a brothel is about respect towards the women. It's recognizing what the women need to basically make them the best employees you can, and that is something just so interesting, because in westerns you are almost creating your own morals, and she has thought about the future and what it means to the people, and McCabe hasn't.
She wants to keep them trapped, though. She definitely, it's not out of the kindness of her heart. There's definitely some manipulation going on. As she said, what are you going to do if they get pregnant? How are you going to get rid of the baby? You got to stay on top of them. If they're not doing this, then they're going to find religion because that's what they're born with. And then you're going to end up filling the church in this town than your own pockets. And I mean, that monologue is so incredible that
it's very likely it'll get the end of this episode.
I mean, it's really good. It's fantastic.
But it's almost like what you'd imagine. I don't know, if you worked at Amazon, they've brought in consultants. They thought, what's the best way to have your employees in your cubicles? If you have this lighting, that'll be better. If you this, that. Basically, you just want how can we make them the best employees? It's a really deliberate system in a way that McCabe isn't. He's starting from level 1, whereas many people are starting at a much more sophisticated level of the best way to allow these things to happen. And this is what's happening. These are things with the most demand, right? That's what the vices are. You have prostitution, you have opium, you have alcohol with the bars. No one is having. There's no Western that's the best way to build the best library.
Yeah, of course.
It's the purest supply and demand.
I was reading Great Movies with one of the Roger Ebert volumes about McCabe as Mrs. Miller, and he said something really interesting. This made his Great Movies list. And he said Altman made a lot of movies that dabbled with perfection. And he mentions Three Women and MASH. And he goes, but he only made one that was perfect. And that's McCabe as Mrs. Miller. And like, I that stuck with me. Like, when I watched it, because I rewatched it this time, and I was going to watch it because, like, I've seen the movie enough now, and I've seen it enough within a year and a half period since the first time I saw it that I felt like I didn't need to rewatch the movie. So I was just going to put it on for a little bit to jog my memory, and ended up watching the whole thing because the composition of this movie and how it flows and the characters and the way they grow and the way the world is like this living, breathing entity. The way Altman does this better than any director probably ever is so engrossing that I couldn't take my eyes off the movie, and I ended up watching the movie again. It's one of those weird things where I feel like, when you make Citizen Kane, you go, man, that's probably one of the greatest movies ever. When you make McCabe and Mrs. Miller, you kind of sit back and go, I think we accidentally made one of the best movies ever.
Well, it's so funny because
like a Groundhog Day type of thing.
It must have been like, I don't know, was it about 6 months ago or so? We were hanging out, and we had a bunch of friends over at your place. And it was a bit later into the night, but not too late. And you threw on a movie. And typically when you do that, you play something like Ghostbusters, Back to the Future, something we've seen a billion times that we could all kind of talk during. Or you're showing me Batman for the billionth time.
We need to watch that again, by the way.
No, we don't. But you put on McCabe Mrs. Miller, and I was actually concerned that you made a bad choice because only you and I had seen the film before. And I felt like, man, is this like the best film you want to put in like 2 beers in while we're all hanging out? Then like no one spoke after 5 minutes.
No, everyone loved it. Yeah, of course they did.
It gripped everybody. And you're watching something where it's all familiar terrain, but you don't fully know what's going to happen next because it has a element of realism and melancholy in an environment that you're not used to, and
comedy.
And some comedy, yeah.
Yeah, which pulls. A lot of that comedy comes from McCabe. The guy's hilarious. Once you guys get those bass build up, I got some chippies up here that'll do more tricks than a monkey on 100 yards of grapevine.
Oh my God.
Like so much stuff like that. It's hilarious.
I mean, Warren Beatty is a really funny guy. I don't know if you saw his most recent thing, which was the Academy Awards. Oh, man, he was a hoot.
He's hilarious. Yeah, the Botched Academy Awards thing. Mm-hmm. He had to... I love how he was like, hey, everybody, this wasn't my fault.
I have watched the clip 1,000 times. It is not his fault.
And I love that he actually, said that.
Yeah.
But yeah, no, I mean, Warren Beatty's awesome. I love Warren Beatty. I can't take my eyes off him. He's a fantastic actor. I mean, just really like one of those ones that kind of sneaks up on you. Like everyone knows Warren Beatty, but then he goes, he's actually really good. Actually, yeah, he is, type of thing.
He reminds me. This is the weirdest thing, of Ted Danson. I'm watching so much Cheers right now, and what you knows about season 9 of Cheers is that Ted Danson is so comfortable in the role that he could just be like tending bar while having the conversation, but not in a distracting way. Warren Beatty always just feels comfortable in the role. And it's like any sort of like weird thing he does is just because that's what Clyde would do.
Yeah, no, yeah, exactly. You're absolutely right. If you haven't seen this movie, because anyone in podcast land, I think this is one of the more obscure movies we've covered, which is kind of kind of surprising because it's a famous Altman Western, but really it wasn't really that readily available on DVD. Like you have to look for it, and then it came out on Criterion.
And that helped a lot because I remember the DVDs I saw when I first saw it were terrible.
Yeah, I mean it didn't have a Blu-ray release.
Yeah.
So so it wasn't just. I mean the movie came out in 72. So it's so it's been like a while, and it's one of those movies that was kind of fading away. But with the Criterion Collection again, you might see a little resurgence of it. I wouldn't be surprised. But yeah, and one thing is, this is an anti-Western when the cowboy rolls into town with a bowler cap on and a mink fur coat.
It's so
I love
true.
that. I love that so much. But yeah, no, and Warren Beatty's great, and both McCabe and Mrs. Miller are both two of the better film characters of all time. Extremely tragic, funny. Anti-Western movie, and would probably be in my top 3 Westerns, probably my second favorite somewhere. Good, it's not going to top Good, the Bad, and the Ugly for me, but it'd be right there with Unforgiven for sure.
Well, I think if you have not seen this film but decided to listen to a half-hour podcast about it regardless, even though we described the ending, I think you will still be pleasantly shocked second to second about this movie because it's just, like all Altman films, filled to the brim with things that you'll keep noticing on your 4th, 5th, and 6th viewing.
Well, also too, this guy's not going to survive in this world. He's just not. Like any competent movie viewer is going to realize towards the end, it's like, oh, how's he going to get his way out of this one? Old sneaky McCabe. The truth is, he never got his way out of anything. Like actually, it just always feels like he does.
Yeah.
So, but anyway, go ahead. You're doing your closure, I know.
So I just recommend that everyone check out this film. It's really interesting. And we did cover it on the Immortals. I did not realize it was long ago. It was like episode 24, something around then. But we'd love to hear your thoughts on the movie. You can go to theartomore.com and you can leave a comment on this episode and let us know what you think of the movie. And while you're there, you can check out other podcasts, including The Immortals, like I said. This week we did episode 86, which involved the shockingly powerful war film, The Battle of Algiers, and the shockingly boring Beverly Hills 90210. Boy,
Battle of Algiers is a movie I need to see again. That's been a long time since I've seen that.
Do you like it?
I did like it, yeah, quite a bit actually. I saw it in college.
I'll tease it. It is one of the only 5 stars that Adam has given on the podcast.
Oh, really?
Yep. I think maybe he's like 4th out of like all categories in 2 years.
Yeah. Not it. Well, I want to ask you now. I'll ask you off air what they were. I'm curious.
I'll have to look them up.
Yeah.
But you all can just listen to every episode. Just go through all 86 and find the ones you liked. And also, while you're there, you can check out Ad Absurdum. I believe this week we will actually have the Westworld episode. Let me just lean over to Sarah.
Maybe.
She says maybe. I'm taking it as a yes.
Sarah, guest appearance on episode, what is this? Episode
67?
Sarah showed up.
She did?
She was on the Fellowship.
She was one of our most downloaded episodes. And, so get excited for that one. And I'll check out the backlog for that and other stuff on the site. But, Eric, where can we find you?
You can find me at Constant Diversion. And Constant Diversion, that's my YouTube channel. And hopefully you can find me sleeping in about an hour. That's what I...
All right. Eric, this was very fun to do. I thought it would be weird being on Skype, but this is kind of like every phone call we have. So
I know.
Speaking
of which, give me a call later.
I will. Well, yeah, of course. And you can catch us all next week where we'll be discussing Nashville, perhaps one of the most famous Robert Altman films.
Mm-hmm.
Until then, I'm Austin Lugar.
I'm Eric Martindale.
Bye, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Listen, Mr. McCabe, I'm a whore and I know an awful lot about whorehouses. And I know that if you had a house up here, you stand to make yourself a lot of money. Now, this is all you've got to do. Put up the money for the house. I'll do all the rest. I'll look after the girls, the business, the expenses, the running, the furnishing, everything. And I'll pay you back Any money you put in the house says you won't lose nothing. And we'll make it 50-50.
Excuse me, you know, I already got a whorehouse operating.
You can't call them crib cows whores. I'm talking about a proper sporting house with class girls and clean linen and proper hygiene.
Well, I don't think you're going to find my clientele up here too interested in that sort of thing.
They will be once they get a taste of it. I'm telling you, with someone up here to handle all them punters properly, you can make yourself at least double the money you make on your own.
What makes you think I ain't thought of that already? Them tents, you know, it's just temporary.
What do you do when one girl fancies another? How do you know when a girl really has a monthly or when she's just taken a few days off? What about when they don't get their monthlies? Because they don't. What do you do then? I suppose you know all about seeing to that. And what about the customers? Who's going to skin them back and inspect them? You going to do that?
Would you?
Because if you don't, this town will be clapped up inside of 2 weeks if it's not already. What about when business is slow? You're just going to let the girls sit around on their bums? Because I'll tell you something, Mr. McCabe. When a good whore gets time to sit around and think, 4 out of 5 times you turn to religion, because that's what they was born with. And when that happens, you find yourself filling the bloody church down there instead of your own pockets. Now, I haven't got a lot of time to sit around and talk to a man who's too dumb to see a good proposition when it's put to him. Do we make a deal or don't we?